The dusty roads of Burkina Faso stretched endlessly under the scorching African sun. In the small village of Koudougou, farmers struggled with their daily tasks, carrying heavy loads of grain and water across vast distances. Their backs ached, their spirits were low, and progress seemed impossible. This was the reality that Captain Ibrahim Traore witnessed during his early military patrols in 2020. Traore was not just any soldier. At 24, he had already earned respect among his peers for his sharp mind and genuine concern for the people. Unlike other officers who stayed in their comfortable barracks, Traore made it his mission to visit remote villages and understand the real challenges facing ordinary Burkinabe citizens. During one particular visit to a farming community, near the Ghana border, something caught his attention. An elderly farmer named Amadou was struggling to transport sacks of millet to the market. The man's son had joined the army, leaving him to manage the farm alone. Amadou's wife had injured her back the previous year, making physical labor nearly impossible for the family. "Why don't you use donkeys like the neighboring villages?" Traore asked the old farmer. Amadou laughed bitterly. "Captain, do you know how much a good donkey costs? More than what I earn in 6 months. And even if I could afford one, where would I find it? The few donkey traders we had have moved to richer regions where people can actually pay." This conversation planted a seed in Traore's mind. He began to notice similar problems everywhere he went. Farmers couldn't transport their crops efficiently. Women walked for hours carrying water containers on their heads. Children missed school because they had to help their families with transportation tasks that could be easily solved with pack animals. But it wasn't just about farming. Traore observed that in regions where donkeys were available, communities were more prosperous. Markets were more active, children attended school regularly, and families had more time for income-generating activities. The connection was clear. Access to donkeys directly impacted quality of life and economic development. As he rose through military ranks, Traore never forgot these observations. When he became involved in political discussions about Burkina Faso's development, he often mentioned the transportation challenges facing rural communities. His colleagues initially dismissed his focus on donkeys as too simple or old-fashioned. "We need modern solutions," they would argue. Trucks, motorcycles, modern infrastructure. But Traore had done his research. He learned that in many parts of Africa and Asia, donkeys remained the most practical and sustainable solution for rural transportation. They required minimal maintenance, could navigate difficult terrain that vehicles couldn't handle, and were environmentally friendly. The turning point came when Traore attended a regional conference on agricultural development in Ghana. There, he met Dr. Sarah Chen, a Chinese agricultural expert who had spent 15 years working on rural development projects across Africa. Dr. Chen shared fascinating statistics about how donkey programs had transformed communities in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Morocco. In Kenya, she explained, communities that received donkeys through development programs saw their average income increase by 40% within 2 years. Children's school attendance improved by 60%, especially among girls who were previously responsible for water collection. Traore was amazed. These weren't just transportation animals, they were tools for social transformation. He began to envision what such a program could accomplish in Burkina Faso, where rural poverty remained a persistent challenge despite the country's mineral wealth. That evening, Traore sat in his hotel room in Accra, sketching out preliminary ideas. What if Burkina Faso could implement the largest donkey distribution program in West Africa? What if every rural family had access to at least one donkey? The economic impact could be revolutionary, but he knew that such a program would require massive resources, careful planning, and international partnerships. Most importantly, it would need to address the root problem: the lack of donkeys in the region and the infrastructure to support them. As he prepared to return to Burkina Faso, Traore made a decision that would later shock both his supporters and critics. He would dedicate his political career to solving what others saw as a simple problem, but what he recognized as the key to unlocking his country's rural potential. The young captain had no idea that his donkey initiative would eventually attract attention from China, create diplomatic discussions at the highest levels, and challenge conventional thinking about development aid in Africa. All he knew was that somewhere in rural Burkina Faso, farmers like Amadou were waiting for a solution that seemed impossibly out of reach. Little did anyone suspect that this unusual focus on donkeys would become one of the most talked about development strategies in modern African politics, eventually drawing both praise and criticism from international observers who couldn't understand why a young leader would stake his reputation on such an unconventional approach. Back in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, Traore faced his first major challenge. When he presented his donkey initiative to senior government officials, the response was mixed at best. Finance Minister Jacques Ouedraogo looked at him with barely concealed amusement. "Captain, you're talking about spending millions of dollars on donkeys while we have pressing needs for modern infrastructure, technology, and defense equipment," Ouedraogo said during a closed-door meeting. "How do you expect us to explain this to international donors and our own citizens?" Traore had anticipated this reaction. He opened his laptop and began presenting the research he had compiled over months of careful study. Charts and graphs filled the screen, showing economic data from successful donkey programs in other African countries. "Sir, consider this," Traore began, his voice steady and confident. "A single donkey costs approximately $200. It can carry loads equivalent to 4 people and can work for 15 to 20 years with minimal maintenance. Compare that to a motorcycle, which costs 10 times more, requires constant fuel, breaks down regularly, and can't navigate the difficult terrain in our rural areas." The room fell silent as officials studied his data. Traore continued. "Furthermore, donkeys reproduce naturally, creating a sustainable supply. One female donkey can produce offspring that will serve communities for decades. But it was his next revelation that truly captured their attention. Traore had discovered something remarkable. During his research, China, the world's largest economy, was facing an unexpected shortage of donkeys for their traditional medicine industry and leather production. Chinese companies were already importing donkeys from various countries, paying premium prices. "This presents us with an unprecedented opportunity," Traore explained. "We can establish Burkina Faso as a major donkey breeding center, not just for our domestic needs but for export to international markets, particularly China." The economics were compelling. While initial investment would be substantial, the program could become self-sustaining and eventually profitable. Burkina Faso could transform from a donkey importing nation to a major exporter, creating jobs and generating foreign currency. Minister Ouedraogo leaned forward, suddenly interested. "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" Traore had done his homework. "China imports approximately 2 million donkey hides annually. The price per hide ranges from $50 to $100 depending on quality. If we could capture even 5% of this market, we're looking at $5 million in annual export revenue, not counting the domestic economic benefits." Over the following weeks, Traore worked tirelessly to refine his proposal. He consulted with veterinarians, agricultural economists, and international trade experts. The plan that emerged was ambitious: establish breeding centers across Burkina Faso, distribute donkeys to rural families at subsidized rates, create veterinary support networks, and develop export infrastructure. The breakthrough came when Dr. Liu Wei, a Chinese trade representative, visited Burkina Faso for unrelated business. During a diplomatic dinner, someone mentioned Traore's donkey initiative as an interesting local development project. Dr. Liu's reaction was immediate and intense. "Did you say donkeys?" Dr. Liu interrupted the conversation. "How many donkeys are we talking about?" Within days, Dr. Liu had arranged meetings with Traore and senior Burkinabe officials. What they learned during these discussions changed everything. China's demand for donkeys was even greater than Traore had initially understood. Chinese companies were struggling to secure reliable suppliers, and prices were rising rapidly due to shortage. "We have been looking for a stable, long-term partner in West Africa," Dr. Liu explained through a translator. "Your proposal is exactly what our companies need, but we would need guarantees of quality, quantity, and consistency." Traore saw the opportunity and seized it. He proposed a partnership that would benefit both countries. China would provide initial funding and technical expertise for establishing breeding programs, while Burkina Faso would guarantee donkey supplies for the Chinese market. But the young leader had an even more ambitious vision. Rather than simply exporting raw donkeys, he wanted to develop processing facilities in Burkina Faso. This would create more jobs, add value to exports, and establish the country as a regional hub for donkey-related industries. The negotiations were complex. Chinese officials wanted exclusive rights to Burkina Faso's donkey production, but Traore insisted on maintaining flexibility to serve domestic needs first and explore other markets. After weeks of discussions, they reached a framework agreement that satisfied both parties. News of the potential China deal began to leak to local media. Initial reactions were mixed. Some praised Traore for finding an innovative solution to rural poverty and unemployment. Others questioned whether focusing on donkeys was the best use of government resources and international partnerships. The controversy intensified when international animal rights organizations learned about the export component of the plan. They raised concerns about donkey welfare and the sustainability of large-scale breeding programs. Environmental groups worried about the ecological impact of expanding donkey populations. Traore found himself defending the initiative on multiple fronts. During a press conference in Ouagadougou, local journalists peppered him with challenging questions about the unusual nature of his development strategy. "Captain Traore, critics say you're turning Burkina Faso into China's donkey farm," one reporter asked. "How do you respond to concerns that this program prioritizes foreign interests over domestic development?" Traore's response was measured but passionate. "This program is first and foremost about helping our rural communities. The export component provides financial sustainability, but our primary goal remains improving the lives of Burkinabe farmers and families." Despite the criticism, momentum was building. International development organizations began to take notice of the initiative. Some expressed interest in supporting the program, recognizing its potential for rural transformation. Others remained skeptical about the unconventional approach. The real test of Traore's vision came when he decided to launch a pilot program in 3 rural districts. He knew that success or failure of these initial projects would determine whether the larger initiative would receive full government support and international backing. The first pilot site was established in Koudougou, the same region where Traore had first encountered farmer Amadou. Using initial funding secured through the Chinese partnership negotiations, the program began with the purchase of 500 donkeys from neighboring Mali and Niger, where prices were lower due to local oversupply. But importing donkeys proved more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Border officials were confused by the unusual cargo. Customs procedures designed for traditional trade goods didn't account for live animals in such quantities. Veterinary inspections delayed shipments, and several donkeys fell ill during transport. Traore personally traveled to the border to oversee operations. What he found was chaos. Donkeys were crowded into inadequate facilities. Some were showing signs of stress and malnutrition, and local veterinarians were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of animals requiring health certificates. "This is a disaster," muttered Dr. Fatima Ouattara, the regional veterinary officer, as she examined yet another sick donkey. "We don't have the infrastructure for this kind of operation." Traore realized that his plan had a fundamental flaw. He had focused on the economic and social benefits of donkey distribution, but had underestimated the logistical challenges of managing such a program. However, instead of abandoning the initiative, he saw this setback as a learning opportunity. Working around the clock, Traore coordinated with veterinary experts, animal welfare organizations, and logistics specialists to redesign the import and distribution process. They established temporary holding facilities with proper food, water, and medical care. They trained local officials on handling procedures and created detailed protocols for animal transport. Meanwhile, word of the program had reached rural communities, creating unexpected demand. Farmers who had initially been skeptical about the government's donkey initiative now lined up to register for the program. Village chiefs organized meetings to discuss how donkey distribution would be managed fairly among families. In the village of Tangaye, Chief Bukari Sawadago called a community meeting under the ancient baobab tree, where important decisions had been made for generations. More than 200 villagers gathered as the sun set, eager to learn about the donkey program. "The government says they will give each family a donkey," Chief Sawadago announced. "But there are more families than donkeys. How do we decide who receives them first?" The discussion that followed revealed the complex social dynamics that Traore hadn't fully considered. Some families were better positioned to care for donkeys due to existing livestock experience. Others had greater need due to physical disabilities or lack of young family members to help with manual labor. After hours of debate, the community reached a consensus. They would prioritize families with disabled members, single mothers, and elderly farmers. They would also establish a community rotation system where donkeys could be shared during peak agricultural seasons. This grassroots problem-solving impressed Traore when he learned about it during village visits. He realized that rural communities had wisdom and organizational capacity that his top-down planning had overlooked. He began incorporating community input into program design, making the initiative more collaborative and locally responsive. The breakthrough moment came when the first donkeys were successfully distributed in Kudugu. Amadou, the elderly farmer who had inspired Traore's initial interest in the problem, was among the first recipients. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks, Amadou was transporting 3 times more grain to market than before. His wife, whose back injury had limited her mobility, could now ride the donkey to visit her sister in a neighboring village. Their grandson, who had been missing school to help with farm work, returned to classes full-time. Word of the success, stories spread quickly through social media and local radio stations. Videos of farmers using their new donkeys went viral on WhatsApp groups throughout Burkina Faso. Public opinion began to shift in favor of the program, but the real validation came from an unexpected source. Professor James Mitchell, an agricultural economist from Oxford University, arrived in Burkina Faso as part of a research team studying innovative development programs in West Africa. Initially skeptical about the donkey initiative, Professor Mitchell spent 3 weeks visiting program sites and interviewing participants. His preliminary findings were remarkable. Families with donkeys were saving an average of 4 hours daily on transportation tasks. Agricultural productivity had increased by 35% among participants. Most significantly, girls' school attendance had improved dramatically in communities where families received donkeys. "This is one of the most cost-effective development interventions I've studied in 20 years of research," Professor Mitchell told a gathering of international development officials in Ouagadougou. The simplicity of the solution is actually its strength. These communities didn't need complex technology or expensive infrastructure. They needed something that worked immediately and required minimal maintenance. News of Professor Mitchell's positive assessment reached international media outlets, suddenly putting Burkina Faso's donkey program in the global spotlight. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera sent reporters to cover what they initially saw as an amusing story about an African leader's obsession with donkeys. However, as journalists witnessed the program's impact firsthand, their coverage became more serious and supportive. They documented dramatic improvements in rural quality of life and highlighted the innovative partnership with China that was making the program financially sustainable. The international attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Development organizations offered additional funding, but they also imposed new requirements for monitoring, evaluation, and compliance with international animal welfare standards. Traore embraced these challenges, viewing them as necessary steps toward scaling up the program nationwide. He established a dedicated donkey program office within the Ministry of Agriculture and recruited specialists in veterinary care, logistics, and international trade. By the end of the pilot program's first year, over 2,000 donkeys had been distributed to rural families across 3 districts. Economic surveys showed significant improvements in household income, children's education outcomes, and women's participation in economic activities. But perhaps the most important indicator of success was the waiting list. More than 10,000 families had registered for the program, and community leaders from across Burkina Faso were requesting that their districts be included in the next phase of expansion. The success of the pilot program created unexpected diplomatic complications for Traore. News of Burkina Faso's expanding partnership with China for donkey trade had reached other African nations, some of which were not pleased with the development. President Ahmed Hassan of neighboring Mali called Traore directly, expressing concerns about the donkey program's impact on regional dynamics. "Brother Ibrahim," President Hassan said during a tense phone conversation, "your Chinese friends are now offering our farmers higher prices for donkeys than they can get in our own markets. This is disrupting our rural economy." Similar complaints came from Niger, Ghana, and Senegal. Farmers in these countries were smuggling donkeys across borders to sell them to Burkina Faso's Chinese partners at premium prices. This was causing donkey shortages in their home countries and inflating prices for local families who depended on the animals for their livelihoods. Traore found himself in a delicate position. The success of his program was inadvertently causing problems for neighboring countries. At an emergency meeting of the Economic Community of West African States, he faced criticism from fellow leaders who accused him of prioritizing Chinese interests over regional cooperation. "This donkey business is causing more problems than it's solving," declared President Marie Conné of Côte d'Ivoire. "We're seeing our farmers abandon food production to become donkey traders. This threatens food security across our region." The criticism stung, but Traore had data to support his program's benefits. He presented detailed reports showing how donkey distribution had improved agricultural productivity in Burkina Faso, leading to increased food production rather than decreased output. "The solution isn't to stop successful programs," Traore argued. "The solution is to expand them regionally. We should work together to develop donkey breeding programs that benefit all our countries." This proposal led to intense behind-the-scenes negotiations. Traore suggested creating a West African donkey development initiative that would coordinate breeding programs, share best practices, and negotiate collectively with Chinese buyers to ensure fair prices for all participating countries. The idea gained traction when economic advisors calculated the potential benefits. A coordinated regional approach could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in export revenue while improving rural livelihoods across West Africa. It could also give African nations more bargaining power in negotiations with Chinese companies. However, implementing this vision required overcoming significant political and practical obstacles. Each country had different agricultural policies, veterinary standards, and trade regulations. Some leaders were reluctant to share their markets with competitors. The breakthrough came during a private dinner that Traore organized for West African heads of state during an African Union summit. Instead of a formal negotiating session, he arranged for them to meet with farmers who had benefited from the donkey program. Fatima Traore, a single mother from rural Burkina Faso, no relation to Ibrahim, shared her story with the assembled presidents. Before receiving her donkey, she struggled to transport water from wells that were kilometers away from her village. Her children often missed school to help with this task. "Now my youngest daughter is the top student in her class," Fatima told the presidents through a translator. "My donkey allows me to collect water quickly, so my children have time to study. I can also transport vegetables to market twice a week instead of once a month." The personal stories resonated with leaders who had grown up in rural communities themselves. They began to see the donkey program not as a threat to regional stability, but as an opportunity for widespread rural development. President Hassan of Mali was the first to change his position. "Perhaps we've been thinking about this wrong," he admitted. "Instead of competing against each other, we should be learning from Ibrahim's success and adapting it to our own countries." Within months, 4 West African nations had signed preliminary agreements to cooperate on donkey development programs. They established shared veterinary standards, created joint training programs for animal care, and began coordinating their negotiations with Chinese buyers. But the regional expansion brought new challenges. Chinese companies, initially excited about accessing larger supplies of donkeys, began to express concerns about quality control and consistency across multiple countries. They had developed specific relationships with Burkina Faso suppliers and were worried about maintaining standards with new partners. Dr. Liu Wei, who had become the primary Chinese liaison for the donkey trade, requested a meeting with Traore to discuss these concerns. Our companies are willing to expand purchases from other West African countries, Dr. Liu explained, but we need guarantees that animals will meet our quality requirements. This led to the establishment of the West African Donkey Quality Certification Program, a regional system for ensuring that exported animals met international standards. The program created jobs for veterinarians, inspectors, and trainers across participating countries. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, the domestic donkey distribution program continued to expand. By the second year, over 15,000 donkeys had been distributed to rural families. The economic impact was becoming visible even at the national level. Agricultural production statistics showed significant improvements in regions where the donkey program was active. Rural to urban migration slowed as farming became more profitable and less physically demanding. School enrollment rates increased, particularly among girls who had previously been required to help with transportation tasks. However, the program also faced new criticism from unexpected sources. International animal rights organizations had launched campaigns against the donkey trade, arguing that the animals were being exploited for commercial purposes. They published reports claiming that donkey welfare standards were inadequate and that the trade was unsustainable. These campaigns gained attention in European media, putting pressure on development organizations that were funding parts of Traore's program. Some donors began to reconsider their support, concerned about being associated with controversial animal trade practices. Traore responded by inviting international animal welfare experts to visit Burkina Faso and inspect the program facilities. He implemented additional welfare standards and created oversight committees that included international observers. The inspection results were largely positive. While some improvements were recommended, international experts found that donkeys in the program were generally well treated and that the breeding operations were sustainable. Dr. Sarah Williams, a veterinarian from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, published a report concluding that the Burkina Faso donkey program demonstrates that commercial animal operations can be both profitable and humane when properly managed and monitored. This validation helped counter negative publicity, but it also highlighted the complex balance that Traore had to maintain between economic development, animal welfare, international relations, and domestic politics. The simple idea of providing donkeys to rural farmers had evolved into a multifaceted program with implications far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. 3 years after launching his donkey initiative, Traore faced his greatest crisis yet. A severe drought had struck West Africa, affecting millions of people across the region. Traditional crops were failing, water sources were drying up, and rural communities were struggling to survive. Critics of the donkey program seized on the drought as evidence that Traore had misdirected resources. While he was playing with donkeys, he should have been investing in irrigation systems and drought-resistant agriculture, charged opposition leader Paul Sankara during a heated parliamentary debate. The criticism seemed justified at first glance. Areas without donkey programs appeared to be suffering equally with those that had received animals. Some international observers began to question whether the entire initiative had been a costly distraction from more pressing development needs. But, as the drought continued, an unexpected pattern emerged. Communities that had participated in the donkey program were adapting to the crisis more successfully than those without donkeys. The animals' ability to travel long distances for water and transport emergency supplies was proving crucial for survival. In the village of Bous, where the donkey program had been implemented 2 years earlier, residents were using their animals to access water sources that were 15 kilometers away. Without donkeys, such distances would have been impossible for families to manage while maintaining their farms and caring for children. Mariam Ouedraogo, a widow who had received a donkey through the program, became a local hero during the drought. She organized other donkey owners to create a water transport cooperative, using their animals to supply water to families who didn't have donkeys. Before the program, when droughts came, we just suffered and waited for rain, Miriam explained to a visiting journalist. Now we can do something. We can travel far to find water and bring it back to our community. The drought response capabilities of donkey-owning communities caught the attention of humanitarian organizations working in the region. The World Food Program began incorporating donkeys into their emergency response plans, recognizing that communities with pack animals could distribute aid more efficiently and reach isolated areas that vehicles couldn't access. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the WFP's regional coordinator, met with Traore to discuss expanding the collaboration. Your donkey program has created resilience infrastructure that we didn't recognize before, she told him. These communities can respond to emergencies independently instead of waiting for external assistance. This revelation transformed international perception of the Donkey Initiative. What had been seen as an unusual development project was now being recognized as a disaster preparedness strategy. Climate adaptation experts began studying the program as a model for building rural resilience in drought-prone regions. The positive attention came at a crucial time for Traore, who was facing increasing political pressure at home. Economic challenges beyond the drought had created public dissatisfaction with his government. Opposition groups were organizing protests, and some of his own supporters were questioning his continued focus on the donkey program. During a particularly tense cabinet meeting, Defense Minister Colonel Diendere challenged Traore directly. "Mr. President, the people are hungry, unemployment is rising, and you're still talking about donkeys. Perhaps it's time to focus on immediate economic needs." Traore's response revealed how much his thinking had evolved since the program's early days. "Colonel, this program has created over 50,000 jobs in rural areas. It has generated $40 million in export revenue. It has improved food security by making agriculture more efficient. It has reduced healthcare costs by improving transportation for medical emergencies." He pulled out a thick folder of statistics and impact assessments. "Most importantly, it has given our rural communities tools to solve their own problems instead of depending on government assistance every time there's a crisis." The data was compelling. Independent evaluations showed that the donkey program had become one of the most successful rural development initiatives in modern African history. Household incomes in participating communities had increased by an average of 60%. Child mortality rates had decreased due to improved access to health care. Agricultural productivity had risen despite challenging weather conditions. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. Rural communities that had previously felt isolated and powerless now saw themselves as capable of independent action. Village leaders spoke with confidence about their ability to handle challenges and opportunities. This empowerment was demonstrated dramatically during a border crisis with neighboring Mali. Armed groups had disrupted trade routes, cutting off several Burkina Faso communities from their traditional markets. Government officials worried about economic collapse in these isolated areas. However, donkey-owning communities quickly adapted by finding alternative routes that vehicles couldn't use. They established new trading relationships with markets in Ghana and Togo, using donkey caravans to transport goods along paths that had been unused for decades. The flexibility and independence shown by these communities impressed international observers. Business leaders began to see rural Burkina Faso not as a development challenge but as an emerging market with unique capabilities. Chinese companies, initially interested only in donkey exports, began exploring other business opportunities in regions where the program had been successful. They found communities with improved infrastructure, educated populations, and entrepreneurial spirit. Li Wei, a Chinese businessman who had established a donkey processing facility in Ouagadougou, expanded his operations to include motorcycle assembly and solar panel distribution. "These communities are different from what I expected," he told Traore during a business dinner. "They have problem-solving abilities and work ethic that make investment attractive." The economic spillover effects multiplied throughout the region. Young people who had learned animal care skills through the donkey program were starting their own livestock businesses. Women who had gained mobility through donkey ownership were establishing trading enterprises that connected rural producers with urban markets. The transformation was most visible in the annual harvest festival in Kudugu, where Traore had first encountered farmer Amadou. What had been a modest local celebration was now a major regional event, attracting visitors from across West Africa and generating significant tourism revenue. Amadou, now in his 70s, had become something of a celebrity as the farmer who inspired the donkey program. During the festival, he spoke to crowds about the changes he had witnessed in his community. When Captain Traore first asked me about donkeys, I thought he was just another young soldier who didn't understand rural life, Amadou recalled with a smile. I never imagined that conversation would change not just my life, but the lives of thousands of families across our country. The festival featured displays of donkey breeds from across the region, demonstrations of new agricultural techniques made possible by pack animal transport, and presentations by international researchers studying the program's impact. But for Traore, the most meaningful moment came when a group of children from the local school performed a song they had composed about the donkey program. Watching. These young people celebrate an initiative that had transformed their community's prospects. He reflected on how much had changed since he first recognized the simple problem of rural transportation. 5 years after its launch, Ibrahim Traore's donkey program had grown beyond anything he had originally imagined. What began as a simple solution to rural transportation problems had evolved into a comprehensive rural development model that was being studied and replicated across Africa and beyond. The numbers were staggering. Over 100,000 donkeys had been distributed to families across Burkina Faso and neighboring countries. The regional donkey trade with China had generated over $200 million in export revenue. Rural household incomes in participating areas had more than doubled on average, but statistics only told part of the story. The real transformation was visible in the changed landscape of rural West Africa. Villages that had been isolated and struggling were now connected to regional markets. Schools that had been half empty were now overcrowded with eager students. Health clinics that had been underused were now serving patients from wide areas, thanks to improved transportation access. The success had attracted attention from the highest levels of international politics. President Xi Jinping of China had mentioned the West African Donkey Partnership during a major speech on China-Africa cooperation. The African Union had designated the program as a model for South-South cooperation and sustainable development. Most remarkably, the initiative had sparked innovation far beyond its original scope. Young entrepreneurs throughout the region were developing donkey-related businesses, specialized veterinary services, custom-designed carts and harnesses, donkey-based tourism operations, and even donkey-powered renewable energy systems. In the town of Bobo Dioulasso, 25-year-old engineer Fatou Sawadogo had invented a donkey-powered water pump that was revolutionizing irrigation in small-scale farming communities. Her design used the animal's natural walking motion to operate pumps that could irrigate up to 5 hectares of farmland. The donkey program taught us to think differently about development, Fatou explained as she demonstrated her invention to a group of visiting agricultural experts. Instead of waiting for expensive foreign technology, we learned to build solutions using resources we already have. This spirit of local innovation had impressed international development organizations, which were increasingly frustrated with traditional aid programs that created dependency rather than self-reliance. The donkey program offered a different model, relatively small initial investments that enabled communities to develop their own solutions to ongoing challenges. Dr. Amina Hassan, the African Development Bank's Director of Rural Programs, had become one of the initiative's strongest advocates. During a major development conference in Nairobi, she presented the donkey program as evidence that Africa doesn't need charity, it needs partnerships that unlock existing capabilities. Her presentation included case studies from across the region. In Ghana, donkey-owning farmers were using mobile phones to coordinate regional marketing cooperatives. In Mali, rural women had established a donkey-based transportation service that was generating significant income while providing essential services to their communities. The program had also influenced China's approach to development cooperation in Africa. Chinese officials, initially interested only in securing donkey supplies for their domestic market, had discovered that supporting rural development programs created stronger, more sustainable trade relationships than traditional resource extraction. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, during a visit to Ouagadougou, announced that China would invest $500 million in expanding donkey and livestock programs across 15 African countries. This partnership demonstrates that cooperation can benefit everyone involved, Wang stated. African communities gain development tools, Chinese companies secure reliable suppliers, and both sides build lasting friendship. However, the program's success had also created new challenges. As demand for donkeys increased, concerns arose about market speculation and price manipulation. Some traders were buying up donkeys in rural areas and reselling them at